Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for our first session in our series of Hope and Healing in Grief. We hope that this series is helpful to everyone who attends and is able to watch it later. And our first session tonight is with Darlene Nelson from the Compassionate Friends, and she'll be talking about early grief when a child dies. So I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to you, Darlene.
Okay, thank you, Leroy. Thank you for coming, thank you for listening, and thank you to Leroy and to Crystal for organizing this. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm a retired LPN. I'm Darlene Nelson, as Leroy said, co-founder of the South Central Minnesota Compassionate Friends. I'm the past leader and newsletter editor, and I'm now on the steering committee. I just don't give up. And I've attended many workshops on grief. I've presented at regional Compassionate Friends conferences. I've had articles published in a few nurses magazines, national magazines. And I'm Clint's wife of almost 65 years and the mother of Mike and David. I'm not a counselor. This is from my own experiences and listening to bereaved parents through the years, both in Compassionate Friends and as patients. This will be on child's death because that is a unique grief. They are part of us. They're our creation. We, our spouse, and God created this little human being. And people often say, when my child died, I felt like I lost a part of myself, like part of me was gone. And it is part of you because they truly are your creation. I felt like when Mike died, it was like an amputation without the benefit of an anesthetic for myself. It's painful beyond belief. Our child, and I consider a child, our child, whether it's miscarriage to adulthood. If we give them life, they are always our child. Clint is my right-hand man in these endeavors. He went with me to Wilmer as we were setting up our chapter. He went with me to Chicago, Omaha, Fargo, Minneapolis, and other places for conferences. And he went with me to Breckenridge, Marshall, and Rochester as we helped them get chapter set up. And he was the financial record keeper for the first 20 years. He's better with numbers than I am, and he also writes nicer. Mike was our firstborn, and he died by drowning while duck hunting on a beautiful fall day, September 30th, 1979. I call it the first day of forever because it was the first day of forever without Mike's physical presence with us. Mike is still with us in memory, in heart. We talk about him, we share about him, and you just do not forget. People tell us to forget, but that's not what we want to do. We not only want to remember them, we want you to remember they were here too, because they were very important, and they were an important part of our life. Mike was an expert swimmer. He was tall and slim. He had a deep voice. He was a nice young man. A friend of his told me at his visitation, Mike was one of the best friends I ever had. I could go to him with any problem and tell him all about it, and he listened. He never gave me advice unless I asked for it, and he never went and squealed to any of our other friends so that they knew what was going on, and that was really, really nice to hear. And Mike was in the era where the hair was a little bit longer, and his standard outfit was the blue jeans and the flannel shirt, and if he had people complaining about his long hair or his clothing, and I wasn't too happy about it, Mike was pretty laid back, and he would always say, "That's okay, Ma, that's their problem, not mine, not yours." He was okay with it. It didn't bother him. I used to hear Mike's voice way back when in my head, and when I couldn't hear his voice anymore, I just remembered things he said and remembered it was a nice, deep voice. That was another letting go. And there are those little letting goes as we work through this grief. Then we had David, 1 year and 21 days after Mike. In our small town, our boys were never Mike and Dave. Our boys were the Nelson brothers or the Nelson boys. So when Mike died, David literally had to learn how to be a single person and be David Nelson. He had a really, really rough time with this, and that's his story to tell. But as typical for young adults, there was alcohol, there was reckless driving, there was reckless behavior, and 2 times Clint and I went into the emergency room in the middle of the night with David, where we well could have been childless. And David decided on his own that enough was enough. He needed to do something and needed to have some structure. And he went to join the Navy, and they talked to him at length and talked about some of these things that had been going on. And they accepted him, which turned out to be very good for them and very good for him. He was in for 24 years. He's now the chief engineer in the ballistic division of the National Missile Defense Agency. And this is our Mike, and this is our Mike. And David is important. So I always have to introduce David too. And this is David and his wife June. And June is from the Philippines. He was married before. And we have 2 wonderful, lovely grandchildren. And my goals for this series, I want you to know it will get better, because it truly does. You have to hang on to that hope and hopefully help some people avoid some of the mistakes that we and others did make. This is not a cure for any pain. It's not a quick fix. There isn't any such thing. And we're not here to resolve anybody's grief or pain. Hopefully I can just lighten some possible anxieties if you know that these feelings I'm having are normal. My biggest goal here again is hope and assurance. You will feel better. My sharing is not necessarily from schooling, but from suffering. My dad was an abusive alcoholic, and when my mom couldn't tolerate it anymore, she left home and was gone for 14 months. Which I felt like a desertion. And then I had my dad and the boys, my brothers, 4 of them, and my 2.5-year-old sister, and I was 14 years old. So it was a pretty hard 14 months. But I learned what I could do and what I was capable of. And of course my sister is what kept me going then, to be able to take care of her. And going to school, which I loved, and my reading, because I'm an avid reader. Everybody go to your libraries and get some books. I love to read. I always said God was trying to teach me some patience when my mom was gone, when they went through their divorce, when my grandma was gone. Then my oldest brother died when I was 24, and he was 28. Then Mike died. And I said, okay, God, I've just about had it. Enough is enough. I don't want any more lessons. But then when our first daughter-in-law was pregnant after our grandson was born, she was 5.5 months along, and the baby died in utero. So we are bereaved parents, bereaved siblings, and bereaved grandparents. Both of us are. I had some close friends die, and I was really quite surprised, because I thought I'd kind of be immune to grief. I had been through all of this, and I didn't think I was hurt quite as bad, or for the length of time I did at times, but I really, really did. I was surprised. Our first hours and days, when David came in and told us Mike had died, I didn't believe it. Mike was an expert swimmer. There's no way he could have drowned in 2.5, 3 feet of water. He could have sat up in the water. Then David mentioned something about the ambulance, so I got on the phone and called the ambulance right away, and I asked them which hospital they took Mike to, and they said none. They're still at the scene of the accident, which should have told me something, but I still didn't believe that he had died. So we hopped in the car and we drove out to the slough, about 1/4 of a mile out of town, And as we were getting in the car, a niece went running by. I didn't know that she had already heard the news, and that's why she was running. But I said to her, Sheila, will you please find Grandma and tell her to come down to our house? Something bad happened, and I don't want David alone. And when we got there, Mike was covered with a tarp. I started to go down to him, and one of the deputies grabbed my arm and told me I couldn't go. He said, no, you don't want to go down there. So I tried to calm myself down as best I could and kind of inch away from him. And when I thought I was far enough away, I ran down there and I pulled the tarp off Mike and looked at Mike. It did not take a nurse, it did not take his mother. Anybody that looked at Mike would know that Mike had died. And of course, I just laid on his body and I just sobbed. And I heard Clint say, oh, Mom. And I felt his hand on my arm trying to help me up, and I walked up there. And I found out later that it wasn't Clint, because he had made the decision not to go down. It was one of the deputies that had came down there. They were very nice. And he said he often felt guilty because he hadn't gone down there, and I did. But then when he heard me describe how awful it was and how bad I felt, and it was like a moment of terror, he was glad he hadn't gone down, and I'm glad he didn't as well. I'm glad he didn't, because that image stuck in my mind for a long, long time. And to me, when I saw Mike's body, and I knew it was true, and I say I saw his body because he was not warm to the touch, he did not have that smile, he didn't have his twinkly blue eyes. It was his shell. It was not what made Mike, the essence of what made Mike, Mike. Now, I talked to many bereaved parents who are really quite put out and quite insulted when somebody talks about the body. They don't want their child to be called the body or a body. Everybody's different. And we all have different ideas based on our past grieving experiences, our age, the age of the child, how dependent we or them were on each other. There are many, many things that go into how we grieve. And different does not mean wrong. Different means not the same. So if somebody is comfortable one way, somebody else another way, as long as you are not hurting anyone else, including yourself, your way is okay. There are a lot of feelings that go on in the first months, years of grief. And feelings, too, are a response to something externally. They're not right or wrong, they're just there. What we do with them is what makes them right or wrong. If somebody says something that I don't particularly like and I feel like giving them a poke in the nose, that is not okay. It's okay to feel that, but not to go ahead and do it. You don't want to do that. If you have some anger as a feeling, and that is an emotion that has to be vented, it has to be taken care of. You can't keep it all bottled inside you. But if you can use it for some good cause, like Candy Lightner, when her daughter was killed by a drunk driver, she started MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Kelly Bevington founded a group called Alive Alone for people that had an only child or all of their children die, and so now they did not have children. And Bob and Charlotte Hewlinger started a group called POM, Parents of Murdered Children, and that group has expanded so it now includes anybody whose loved one has died by homicide or by murder. Their 19-year-old daughter was murdered by a former boyfriend who was jealous, and not a good way to try to solve anything, but they channeled their anger and their feelings into a good cause. It's helped a lot of people. Pain, disbelief, despair, guilt, hopelessness, helplessness, rage. You can just name all kinds of words that are heavy words for bereaved parents, but if you haven't been there as a bereaved parent, a bereaved sibling, a bereaved grandparent, they're just words. You can't really feel them if you haven't really experienced them. So that's a little difficult. Grief's intensity does not make it abnormal. It does not make it more morbid. It's as natural as sleeping if you're tired, sneezing if your nose is itching, eating if you're hungry, or crying with pain. How we grieve depends on a lot of different things, and one of the things for bereaved parents and bereaved siblings that I have talked to and that I have read literature and I've heard speakers talk about is the fact that there's this conspiracy of silence where people don't want us to talk about our child that died. When Mike died, at times, if I mentioned something about Mike, just perfectly natural in the course of a conversation, things could just go quiet. I told Clint, I called it the big chill, because nobody wanted to listen, and they just didn't understand that when you hear your child's name, that's pretty nice, that's music to your ears. And Clint always kidded me that I got so many calls at home from people about medical things that he said he was going to make a shingle and hang outside the house that said, Hanska Satellite of the new Ulm Medical Center. Well, then one day he said to me, Mom, I'm going to make that sign. But he said, I'm going to say quarantine. And then, so they know why they're staying away. Well, then I was reading a book, and there wasn't a whole lot of literature out then, by Reverend Simon Stevens, and he is a pastor in the UK, and he's the one that actually started Compassionate Friends. And then, as he says, he came across the pond and helped a couple in Florida get one started in the United States, and from there it spread to over 600 chapters now. His book was titled When Death Comes Home, and it talked about how if you hear of a child that dies, how you can put this aside because it's just so awful you can't even think about it. Well, when death comes home, you can't do that anymore. It's right there. It's in your house. You have to face it. And it is hard work, and it is work. It expands a lot of energy, a lot of sleepless nights, and there are physical as well as emotional and spiritual changes that go on with this. Physically, people will say, and I hear this a lot, I just feel like I have a broken heart. My heart actually hurts. It really does. The broken heart syndrome has a medical term, and it is a medical condition. It's called stress myocardiopathy. All of the emotions that you are feeling that go into your heart can actually cause it to flutter, and you do have pain with it. So it's a real thing. Another one is the globus hysteria, where you feel like you've got this glob in your throat, and people come in and they just know that there's something stuck in their throat. It's just sitting there. It's horrible, but there's nothing there. We had one lady that was telling us that her doctor had diagnosed this, but she said, at least now I know what it is, but I still can't eat anything but yogurt. She said, I'm eating yogurt, 3 times a day, 7 days a week. And then one of the dads said, I thought it was just me, and it was all in my head. Well, he said, I guess it is. But no, it isn't. It's real. And he said, my go-to is scrambled eggs. He said, the only variation is, do I have 2 or do I have 3 or 4? But he said scrambled eggs. And then one of the grandmothers shared that every time she washed her hair, she had this, and she would just be choking. She couldn't hardly do it. And she said, I ended up with ice cream. That was my go-to. So there are real things. The T cells in your body affect your immune system, and the count on them is down. And this is why people that are grieving often have more colds, more tummy upsets, more headaches than they've ever had before. And I know my first year, I had more colds than I think I'd had the last 5 years put together because I just didn't have them that often. Then another thing is the tears. They've done studies on the tears, and there's an actual different chemical makeup to tears, whether it depends on if you're peeling that onion, or if you're crying because you're laughing so hard, or if you're crying because you're in pain with grief. And tears are a necessity. They're therapeutic. They're a way for nature to help our heart heal. I had a hard time crying because I tried to hold it in because I felt I couldn't be crying when I was at work. I had to get my work done. So that was a very difficult one for me. But they are healing, and for people that can cry, it's the best thing ever. And when people tell you, don't cry, oh, you mustn't cry, they're in a better place. Baloney. One man that was a funeral director and then went into counseling, Richard Overshaw, who is absolutely a fantastic speaker, he said, if I am at a funeral again, and the pastor says, now don't cry, he said, I am going to jump right in that pew and I'm going to say, time out, and I'm going to tell them, Jesus wept. And they said, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. If you don't mourn, how do people know that you need any comfort or that you need any help? They may think, boy, they're really strong, they're really doing well, while inside, internally, you feel like you're bleeding to death inside. Sometimes we kind of gently have to tell them, and this is hard because we're the one that's hurting, but yet we have to tell people what will and will not help. Our child died. The love we had for them did not. And there are a lot of tough questions with this. We first have to get through the funeral. What are we going to do for clothes? Okay. I picked out 3 outfits. I brought them down and showed them to Clint and to my wonderful mother-in-law. And Clint just looked at them and looked at me and looked at them, and I don't know that he said anything. And my mother-in-law had tears in her eyes, but she was very stoic Norwegian. She didn't cry real easily or show emotions, and she pointed to one set that she thought would be the best. And then when we were going up to the funeral, David said to me, and we were close by so we could walk when we were going up to the visitation, he said to me, Mom, I hope you won't be mad at me, but I want to remember Mike as he was. I'm not going to go in and view him. I said, David, you have to do what works right for you. But I said, I'm going to strongly encourage you to see Mike. He looks much better now, I'm sure, than he did out at the lake, the slough. And I said, seeing is believing. Well, when we got there, he almost ran. He was in there before Clint and I were, and he was glad that he had seen Mike. Mike had a friend that didn't live there in Hanska anymore then, so his mother called and told him, and he knew it wasn't true, because it just couldn't be. Then he got a call from the funeral director telling him that the family had requested he be one of the casket bearers. Would that be okay? And he said yes, but he knew it wasn't true. And then he drove to Hanska, and he still knew it wasn't true. He walked into the visitation. He went right over and looked at Mike. He even laid his hand on Mike's chest and kind of put his head down a little bit. He turned to me, he put his head on my shoulders, and he just sobbed, and he said, Darlene, it's true. He did not believe until he actually saw. And there again, if you or any of your family made a decision not to see your loved one after they had died, and now you wish you had. We can't go back and change things, so you kind of just have to let yourself off the hook and know you did the best you could in a very, very difficult time that was just charged with so many emotions. Grief work may be the hardest work we ever have to do. It expands so much energy. They have said from studies that 24/7 grief work is actually harder than digging a ditch for an 8-hour day. Well, I lived on a farm, and I've done both, and I will agree, because if you dig a ditch, you can take a shower or bath, you can have a meal, and you can have a good night's sleep, and you probably start to feel better. Because if you're doing this, you're younger, so you're not going to have the aches and pains we do when we get a little bit older. And in grief, you might ask, what is a good night's sleep? When I'd wake up in the morning and I'd think, oh, I have to wake up the boys. Well, then this megaphone that was sitting on my shoulder started screaming, well, Mike is dead, Mike is dead. And it goes with you. Wherever you go, it goes with you. Grief is an affirmation of life. It's an affirmation of love. It only exists where love has existed. Don't let anyone set you a timetable and tell you it's been this long, you should feel this way. It's been this long, you should be over this by now. They're not in your shoes, and the length of time it takes for you to grieve is however long it takes for you. And literally, we do grieve for the rest of our lives. It's a shadow grief, and when we have the grief burst attacks, I call them, that hit us because of a song or because we read in the paper where a good friend of our child has died in a car accident or something 10 years later. And this brings things rushing back to us. The intensity isn't as deep. It doesn't last as long, but it's always there. I was very surprised a few years back in the fall when Mike should have been 60 years old. And this was a milestone that meant he has been away from us twice as long as what we actually had him in our life. This isn't fair. And it isn't. But we can't do anything about it, or every one of us would. So we do have to work at the grief. We can't just think, as some people will say, well, time will change this. Time alone just turns the pages on the calendar. It doesn't really resolve the grief unless we do something and do some work to help ourselves, whether it's reading, whether it's thinking, whether it's journaling, whatever we do. I journaled a lot. And when I would have times that something would really hit me, and I would think, am I making any progress at all? I would go back and I would look in my journal and I'd read and I'd say, oh yes, I am, you know. It may be slow at times. It may be 2 steps forward and 3 back some days. But I am making some progress. Our child is gone. They're gone forever, and that's a long, long time. But the thoughts, the feelings, and the memories, they're here forever. We just want the good memories to start to outweigh the difficult ones. Grief is not an illness to treat. It's a life journey we must go through. There's no little capsule to give us that we can swallow, and whoopee, the grief is gone. It just doesn't go like that. Grief is a price we pay for loving someone. We need to express this. We had 2 dads at a conference that we were at in Fargo that were brother-in-laws, and their boys had been killed by a drunk driver in a car accident. And they said what they did, and I always liked this because I never would have thought of something like that, but they said they went to rummage sales and they bought cheapy glass dishes. They came home, set up a tarp so they would never mess against the side of the garage And they pitched those dishes and they broke them and just laughed and cried together. And then they cleaned up the mess and went about their business again. But they said they had actually gone to garage sales 2 or 3 times and picked up dishes and broke them deliberately. We don't think of people usually doing that, but that is a much better way to get rid of it than holding it all inside and screaming at your wife, who then screams at the kids, and the kids scream at the dog, and the dog chases the cat and bites the cat or something. The broken dishes were a much better idea. Sometimes we think when we see other bereaved parents and we hear laughter, we think, it's only been 3 months and they're laughing. I don't think I'll ever laugh again. Or we go to a wedding and they're actually out on the dance floor dancing, and it's only been 6 months since their child died. It was hard enough to get here, much less this is much worse for me. They must not have loved my child as much as I do mine. But then when they start to get a chance to talk to these people, they realize, oh yes, they did. They're moving on with life, and they get me. They really do. I am kind of like them. What can we do about grief? Well, first off, we need to experience the pain in order to resolve it. We have to try to empty our minds of the hateful things to others that didn't help us. I sincerely believe that people do the best they can. They don't deliberately hurt us. They just don't know how to show that they care. And I had to think, when I heard somebody saying something that was not helpful and that was hurtful at the visitation, I had to tell myself, they're here, giving of their time and giving of their self. They're trying. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. If I would be angry with them, they probably wouldn't even know it. If they could tell by my attitude that I was angry because of their actions or inactions, they probably wouldn't know why, but I would be eaten up inside. And so I just had to let go of the anger. And I hope anybody that's hearing me is able to work on that if you have a lot of anger in some way, so that you don't have that with you, because it can literally eat you up. I and Clint and a young couple, Carol and Barb Netsky, along with a public health nurse, we worked our butts off to get a Compassionate Friends chapter started in our south central Minnesota area, because we wanted to be there for other people that we felt may be hurting just as much as we were. When your child dies, you have intense shock, preoccupation with the child, your brother, your grandchild, their death. This is, I think, nature's way of numbing us somewhat so we can get through the days ahead, the visitation, the funeral, the writing out the cards afterwards, whatever we have to do. If I had somebody that talked to me just within months of a child or a brother that they were very close to or a grandchild that had died, and they'd say, oh, I'm doing much better than most people. I pretty much worked through this. I really kind of worried about them. And invariably, we would see them coming in to see the doctor for one thing after another physically and never could find anything major wrong. So grief can't be rushed. It can be delayed. We had one gentleman that became a friend of mine through Compassionate Friends who gave me a wonderful idea. He said he really did not work on his grief when his daughter died for 7 years. And then a friend of his at work who thought, you don't get your act together, you're going to end up losing your job. He said, you are going to a Compassionate Friends group with me. So he went and he found these people understood him. He wasn't totally alone. And so he decided he was going to have a Kathy's Day. And he told us what Kathy's Day was. Well, I adopted that idea right away. So we had a Mike's Day. So when it was the anniversary date of Mike's death, we would take off work and we would just bum. We might go out to eat. We might go have a cheeseburger and a malt, which was Mike's favorite. You get older, you can't do that so much because your tummy tells you not to. But at first we could do that. And we have a Mike's Day, and we still have Mike's Day, even after 43 and a half years. When it comes this September, there will be Mike's Day. Anger is often called a mystery feeling. I wrote an article about this that I think must have been okay because it's been picked up in many different Compassionate Friends newsletters around the United States. It was picked up in a parenting health magazine, national magazine, and I made some copies of that, and they're on the back table. A grief counselor who did a lot of work with Compassionate Friends again said this conspiracy of silence is one of the hardest things that bereaved parents and bereaved siblings say that they work with. Now, this Dr. Richard Obershaw that I talked about, that was going to jump in the church pew and yell time out, he said, the obituary says, I need help. Something's awful has happened. This is where I'll be. This is when I'll be there. Please come and support me. He said, that's what the obituary is really saying. Well, I never thought of it that way, but that makes a lot of sense to me. When people would tell me, my stepfather, who was a lovely man, and I loved him all to pieces, but his work that he was doing with Mike's grief through his pastor was not very helpful for him or for me, because he used to always tell me, when are you going to quit working with that death group? I really don't like it that you're doing anything with that death group. Compassionate Friends is not a death group. It is a life group. Every time somebody comes through the door or picks up one of our newspapers to read it to see what somebody else is thinking or feeling, they're saying, I want to feel better. I want to feel better. I don't want to feel like this. We're a life group. Graveside visits, there's no right, there's no wrong. Whatever works for you. When we went to the cemetery, I would always tell David where we were going. And I told David, that is simply because in this house, I think everybody tells everybody where they're going to go so that you don't worry and so you know. It's not trying to run your life. It's not trying to keep track of you every minute. It's just common courtesy. It doesn't mean that I think you should go with us. You do what works for you. And it was a long time before David was able to go out there, and not with us. And 9 months to the day, or 9 years to the day after Mike died, or his burial, was my mother's. And my stepfather, who had early Alzheimer's by then, pulled a rose out of the wreath, and he just literally ran over to Mike's headstone, and he laid the rose there. And I was so shocked because I didn't think he would even know where it was. And he looked at me and he said, Mama told me to give a rose to Mikey. And David just lit out for the car. It was really tough for him. Kids' actions are very difficult. I have had parents that have had a toddler or an infant die, and they come in and they don't know what's going on with the other kids because this one's started to wet the bed and they've never done this. This one is whiny and clingy all the time. They've never been like that. And for the teenage group, young adult group, a lot of them, like I said before, there's risky behavior and it's really scary. And too many times, because to me, one time is too many times, but too many times we have had young people that have died and another young person in the family has attempted suicide or died by suicide. Very, very difficult, very difficult for the family. Then they have an added grief because of, why didn't I see this coming? What could have I done? Didn't I do something right? The kids, young teenagers and the young kids, I would say from like 9, 10 years old, that an author, Harriet Schiff, who wrote The Bereaved Parent many, many years ago, interviewed a bunch of kids, and I was just floored because every single child she talked to, every single one, with no exception, said that at the time of the funeral, they felt they were lied to about something or other, the cause of the death. They weren't allowed to go to the funeral. They weren't allowed to go to the visitation. They wanted, some say, in the flowers or something, and they got, or a song, and they were not listened to at all. That really hurt to hear that none of the kids felt that they had had a positive interaction with their parents at the time. It was really, really hurtful. Sometimes one parent wants to talk, the other one doesn't, and maybe the siblings have some questions they want to ask, but maybe they just want to be left alone. We had one couple that their 17-month-old died, and their little girl that wasn't in preschool yet, that was her little playmate. And she would be playing on the floor with little cousins or neighbor kids or something, and all of a sudden, she was just sitting up on the Davenport, and her mom asked her, she said, "What are you doing up there?" "I'm missing my sister." If they're old enough to feel, they're old enough to hurt. And no matter how young the child is, Dr. Seuss said it best, a child is a child, no matter how small. So they feel this. And we would have people come in that had babies that were really good babies. And then all of a sudden a toddler died in the family. And they had one cranky baby. The baby didn't want a nurse, the baby was colicky, the baby just was having a terrible time. They don't really know what went on, but they certainly sense what's going on with mom and dad. So they do have feelings. It does affect them. Kids said to Harriet, we want to be talked to, we want to be talked with, not talked at. And there is a difference, and you have to stop and take consideration of that. And at one Compassionate Friends conference that I was at, they were making photo pins, and I was going to have a photo pin made of Mike. And I very quietly told the young man that was doing this, we have 2 children, and David is important too, and I don't want him to think he's not. If I leave a picture with you, would you do a picture for me of him too? And he said, of course I will. I'd be glad to. He said, that's a good idea. This voice behind me said, well, somebody that doesn't think we're chopped liver. And I turned and looked, and this was a young bereaved sibling that I knew, and I knew her parents well. They're not living anymore. But apparently, because her sibling that had died was so outstanding in sports and in his grades and his looks and everything that she wasn't, she felt like chopped liver. And I felt so bad afterwards because as a bereaved parent and sibling, I thought I should have done better. All I did was reach over and patted her on the arm and did a little smile. And I walked away because I was so floored. And I thought afterwards, why didn't you give her a hug? Why didn't you tell her she's not chopped liver? Why didn't you tell her that she's important too? But I just didn't think that fast because I was so floored to hear her calling herself chopped liver. Unfortunately, that young lady died by suicide about 3 years after her brother died. So when I heard that, I felt guilty, and realistically, we don't do anything that's going to hurt anybody. That's just not what people normally do, but there still is the guilt. Clint felt guilty because he woke the boys up that morning so they could go hunting. David felt guilty because Mike had said when they came in at noon how tired he was, and David had said, well, We've got one pair of hip waders, let me wear them, I'll walk in. And Mike said, no, I'm the better shot, I'm going in, you can shoot whatever I don't get. And David thought he should have insisted. Well, I knew it was my fault because every time they went out, I would say, you know, God, you got to take care of these boys, bring the boys home safely, bring the boys home safely. I can't watch them now, you have to take care of them. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's home now, he's safe. But he's not in the home I wanted him in, and I did this. So we all have guilt. It's oftentimes unrealistic, but it's real to us. One of the harder things that bereaved parents have to do is take care of their remaining siblings. Sometimes we just don't have the answer. We just are lost ourselves. Sometimes we have to ask why. Why is an important part of grieving. We have instant lights if we flick a switch. We have instant television if we push that remote button. If we poke that microwave, we have instant hot soup. We want instant answers because we are a nation of instants. We never really find out why, but we have to ask all the whys we need to ask. I think I probably asked thousands of them, and then suddenly one day it dawned on me, if I had an answer to why, it wouldn't bring Mike back, and it wouldn't take away the pain. So for the most part, I can quit asking why. There's still times when I ask why, and that's okay. Shakespeare said way back when, everyone can master grief except he who has it. Mark Twain said, I can handle any adversity as long as it isn't mine. And that's kind of just about what it is. Some of the things I found that helped in grieving and helped with coping was rest. Even if I couldn't sleep, just so my body was having some quiet time. I listened to some tapes on meditation, and there were times when I laid on the Davenport and I put my little recorder on the tummy and put the tape on where I actually fell asleep and had a nice little relaxing nap. Eat right if you can. If you can eat more healthy, your blood sugar levels stay better, and elevated blood sugars can affect your mood. So try to eat. We need some time alone each day to think and just sort through our thoughts, whether that's when we're showering, soaking in a tub, reading if you can possibly concentrate, gardening, biking, golfing, breaking dishes, although they didn't do that alone. I used to bike out to Lake Hanska Church and sat in the rocking chair in the dark, and I just rocked and relaxed and before I went home and went to bed. It would have been nice to have done this in my own church that was a half a block away, but we had some trouble with some of the younger people going in and drinking the communion wine, so unfortunately our church got locked up and I couldn't get in. But we also need time with others. We can't just withdraw into ourselves because this will prolong our grief. Do some things that are fun and physical, whether it's playing with the grands, whether it's swinging, whether it's riding bike, whether it's gardening. I really gardened, I really beat that dirt up. and gardening, if you think about it, when you're putting these bulbs or whatever you're putting in the ground, it's a sign of hope that something's going to come up. That's our expectation. Complete some task every day. Be gentle with yourself, but still be firm. I was sitting down one day and I looked under toward the buffet, the china closet, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's a whole crop of dust bunnies underneath there. I better do something about that. Well, the dust bunnies got cleaned out, but the china cabinet waited for another day when I did the things inside of it, and another day for the outside. And it was the same way with if I decided, okay, it's time to clean the stove, clean the hood and part of the top, another day clean the oven. If I'm going to clean the shower, maybe only one wall one day. Eventually you get something done, but be gentle, be firm. Community support again, I say, I think people want to help, they don't know how. I had a co-worker that told me, which I thought was beautiful and surprised the heck out of me at the time. She said, Darlene, I'm an only child. I grew up in a household that had plenty of money. I never wanted for anything. My folks were wonderful. She said, my marriage is going good. I got 3 great kids that are doing good. I've really never had anything, and I want to help you, and I don't know how. What can I do? And that was wonderful for somebody to ask me that. Another co-worker told me that every morning when she started to dry her hair, and she turned the blow dryer on, and she did her curling for 1 year, that was her Nelson prayer time, that she prayed for all of us, which was very helpful to know that, because it reaffirmed Mike's life. Somebody was remembering him. At Christmas time, I came home one night, the first Christmas, and I was just absolutely exhausted. And there was a rap on the door, and I thought, who is there? I don't want company. But I went to the door, and it was a neighbor lady. And she said, I saw you come home, and I realized you just got home. So she said, I'm not going to come in. You must be tired. But she said, I thought maybe with the holidays you would be having some company. And I thought maybe you really didn't feel like baking. So I brought you a tray of cookies, and I brought you a Christmas bread. And I told Irene, that is fantastic. That was really great. There was little angels here and there, but we were kind of unaware of them. One thing for coping, no drugs or alcohol, please. That can further depress you. That's like putting a small Band-Aid on a major dirty gaping wound. It's not going to do a thing. It's okay to feel depressed. And there is a difference between real depression and profound sadness. At one point, I felt I was really depressed, and I went to a counselor who I knew through work, and I talked to him for my hour. And when I got all done, he leaned back in his chair and he said, Darlene, I want you to come back and see me in a week. In the meantime, he said, will you give me permission to call your doctor and see if I can get you a prescription for some lithium? I was so angry. I thought, I feel worse than I did when I came in. You are not the counselor for me. Just because somebody is a professional does not mean they can help you. He had helped a friend of mine when she got a divorce tremendously. And I just thought, I'm not coming back to you, and I didn't. But the one good thing was, I was so upset with him, and I was so convinced that he hadn't really listened to me, that I really cried. So I got rid of a ton of tears, and that was good. The big help for me was Compassionate Friends, of course, because I could go in, get rid of the For the World mask, and I could talk about something and see gentle smiles and the head nodding and thought, they know about that. And we were talking about loss of concentration one time, and I told about the morning I got up and I got all ready for work, and I was doing something with my hair, and I grabbed my blue Miss Breck and I sprayed my hair, and it went, and I looked at my can, whoops, I just sprayed my head with the Lysol. And a young man there started laughing. He had beautiful hair, and he said, that's what I did tonight. And when we were in Fargo at a conference, there were 2 mothers there. They were sitting not together, didn't know each other. One set of parents was from Fargo, one set was from Canada. And the young mother was talking, and she was saying that her only child had died at the babysitter with a shaken baby syndrome. And she said, now I'm so afraid to have another baby, because she said, who will I trust to take care of my child? She said, I just don't know what to do. And I think everybody in the place heard this audible gasp, and we all turned and looked, and here was this young couple that was from Canada, and that was how their baby had died, and they only had the one child at that point, and they were thinking the same thing. So after that workshop was over, I mean, those people were together, and they were like Velcro for the rest of the conference, because they had found somebody that really, really understood what they were going through. So, and there are some roadblocks to resolution, and I wish I could go back to some of them and some of the cliches that people use that aren't helpful at all. But I've been talking for an hour, and that's about the maximum time that people really like to set, unless it's a football game, or a hockey game. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. If you ever want to hear more of what I have to say, then you have to talk to Leroy to have me back again. And I do have some handouts on the back table. There's some samples of newsletters. There is information on the Compassionate Friends Conference that's in Denver, Colorado this year. And then I did bring, like I said, the one that I had on anger that has been reprinted so often, and some of the reflections that I have done through the years, which will show a change in how I was doing too, I think. So thank you for coming, and I hope you all come, or tune in through Zoom or whatever to hear Ann when Ann comes in April. And thank you again, Leroy.